The thundering of hooves and the distant whistle of the afternoon train provided a cruel accompaniment to Zara Richardson's tears as she sat crumpled on her travel trunk beside the freshly laid railroad tracks, her black mourning dress gathering dust from the Dakota Territory winds of 1878. Her delicate shoulders shook with each sob, the telegram clutched in her trembling hand, the paper that had traveled faster than she could to bring news of her husband's passing, leaving her alone at the remote whistle stop with nowhere to go. Yeager Hoffman saw her from half a mile away, a dark silhouette against the golden prairie grass. He slowed his team of horses, squinting beneath his worn Stetson at the unusual sight. Travelers waiting for trains wasn't uncommon, but something about the woman's posture spoke of desperation that tugged at him despite his determination to reach White Pine by sundown. "Whoa there," he called to his horses, pulling back on the reins as he approached. His wagon wheels creaked to a halt several paces from where she sat. The young widow barely registered his presence, lost in her grief. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, dancing around her tear-stained face in the prairie breeze. "Madam." Yeager's voice was gentle but carried over the wind. "Are you waiting for the eastbound? It ain't due till tomorrow morning." Zara looked up, startled by the voice that broke through her despair. She hastily wiped at her tears with a handkerchief already damp with use. "The station master said as much," she managed, her voice hoarse. "I have nowhere else to go." Yeager climbed down from his wagon, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he approached. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that had seen their share of hardship. "May I ask what's troubling you, madam? A lady shouldn't be alone out here with night coming on." Zara's fingers tightened around the telegram. "My husband, he's gone. I was traveling to join him in White Pine where he'd found work in the silver mines. But this." She held up the crumpled paper. "This arrived at the last station. There was a cave-in 3 days ago." Yeager removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam." He glanced at the vast, empty landscape stretching in all directions. "White Pine, you say? That's where I'm headed. Got a small ranch just outside of town." Hope flickered momentarily in Zara's reddened eyes, quickly replaced by caution. "I couldn't impose, sir. I don't even know you." "Yeager Hoffman, madam," he said with a small bow of his head. "And it ain't no imposition. Can't in good conscience leave you out here for the coyotes and the elements." He gestured toward the gathering clouds on the horizon. "Storms coming in, besides." Zara hesitated, weighing her limited options. The small depot building was locked until the next train arrived, and the thought of spending the night outdoors filled her with dread. "I'm Zara Richardson," she finally said. "Mrs. Zara Richardson," Yeager nodded, offering a weathered but clean hand. "Mrs. Richardson, I'd be obliged if you'd allow me to help you to White Pine. The least I can do is get you somewhere safe while you figure things out." With reluctance born of proper upbringing rather than genuine fear of the earnest cowboy, Zara placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. Her legs, cramped from hours of sitting, nearly buckled beneath her. Yeager steadied her with a respectful hand at her elbow. "Let me get your trunk," he said, lifting the heavy box with surprising ease. He secured it in the wagon bed among his supplies, seed for planting, tools, and provisions to last through the coming months. He returned to where she stood, looking lost against the vast landscape. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms, and when she nodded, he lifted her as gently as he might a wounded bird and placed her on the wagon seat. The simple act of kindness being lifted and cared for, when she felt so terribly alone, nearly broke what remained of her composure. Fresh tears threatened as Yeager climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It's about 4 hours to White Pine," he said, setting the team in motion. "We'll have to outrun that storm, but these boys are strong." He clicked his tongue and the horses moved forward at a steady pace. Zara sat rigidly beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You're very kind, Mr. Hoffman." "Out here, kindness ain't optional, Mrs. Richardson," he replied, his eyes on the horizon. It's survival. They traveled in silence for some time, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the horses breathing the only sounds beyond the occasional sigh of the wind through the grass. Yeager respected her grief, not pressing her with questions or empty platitudes. Eventually, Zara spoke, her voice stronger than before. My husband Thomas wrote that white pine was growing, said there might be opportunity for a schoolteacher. She twisted her wedding band absently. I taught back in Pennsylvania before we married. Yeager nodded. Towns desperate for a teacher, truth be told. Lost the last one to marriage, she moved to Oregon with her husband. He glanced at her. If that's something you might consider once you've had time to grieve, she finished for him, a bitter edge to her voice. I've been grieving since we left Pennsylvania. Thomas was always chasing the next opportunity, the next boom town. She sighed. I barely saw him these past 2 years. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Yeager urged the horses to a faster pace. We'll make it before the worst hits, he assured her, though concern creased his brow. The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Instinctively, Yeager put out an arm to steady her, then quickly withdrew it once she was secure. Beg pardon, madam. It's all right, she said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. I appreciate your consideration. The temperature dropped as the storm drew closer, and Zara shivered in her light traveling clothes. Without a word, Yeager reached behind the seat and pulled out a worn but clean woolen blanket, which he handed to her. Oh, I couldn't, please, Mrs. Richardson. I'm used to the cold. She accepted the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled of cedar and horses, and something distinctly masculine that she found oddly comforting. Thank you. As they traveled, Yeager pointed out landmarks, a distant butte shaped like a sleeping dog, a stand of cottonwoods that marked a hidden spring, the skeletal beginnings of what would someday be a proper road. His deep voice was a steady presence against the growing fury of the approaching storm. The first fat raindrops began to fall when they were still an hour from White Pine. Yeager frowned at the darkening sky. We need shelter, he said, turning the wagon toward a small ridge. There's an old line shack up ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there. Zara nodded, too cold and tired to argue. The rain came harder, driven by gusts of wind that threatened to tear the blanket from her grasp. By the time they reached the small wooden structure nestled against the hillside, they were both soaked. Yeager jumped down and quickly unhitched the horses, leading them to a lean-to attached to the shack. Then he returned for Zara, lifting her down with strong hands that lingered only as long as necessary. The line shack was basic but sound, a single room with a small iron stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Yeager worked quickly, starting a fire in the stove with supplies left for just such emergencies, while Zara stood dripping and uncertain near the door. You should get out of those wet things, he said practically, then flushed as he realized how his words might sound. I mean, I have a spare shirt in my pack, it's clean, I'll step outside while you change. You'll catch your death, Zara protested, looking at his rain-soaked clothes. I've weathered worse, he said with a slight smile, but the shiver that ran through him betrayed his words. Zara made a decision. Turn your back, she said firmly. We're both adults, Mr. Hoffman. You've been a gentleman, and I trust you'll remain so. There's no sense in you standing in the rain on my account. Yeager looked surprised but nodded, turning to face the wall. He busied himself with stoking the fire, keeping his eyes averted as the sounds of rustling fabric filled the small space. His spare shirt would be like a dress on her small frame, but it was dry and warm. You can turn around now, she said after a few minutes. He did, and the sight of her nearly took his breath away. Her damp hair hung in loose waves past her shoulders, and his blue cotton shirt indeed reached almost to her knees. She'd kept her modest underthings on, he was sure, but still, there was an intimacy to the moment that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Your turn, she said, gesturing toward the corner where she'd hung her dress to dry. I'll look away. True to her word, she turned to face the wall, listening to the sounds of him changing into dry clothes. The small shack suddenly seemed even smaller, the air between them charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with the lightning crackling outside. "All decent," he said after a moment, and she turned to find him in a fresh shirt and trousers, his hair damp and tousled. They stood awkwardly for a moment before Yeager gestured to the small table. "I've got some jerky and hardtack in my bag, not much of a meal, but it's perfect," Zara said quickly. "I haven't eaten since morning." They sat across from each other, the modest meal between them. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a different kind of tension was building, not unpleasant, but undeniable. "Tell me about your ranch," Zara said, breaking a long silence. Yeager's face softened. "It's small, but it's mine. Paid for it with 5 years of driving cattle up from Texas. Got a decent herd started, built the house myself." Pride colored his voice. "It's nothing fancy, but there's good water and the soil's not bad for growing." "It sounds lovely," she said sincerely. "What about you? What was Pennsylvania like?" he asked. Zara's expression grew distant. "Green." "So very green. My father was a doctor in a small town outside of Philadelphia. I grew up surrounded by books and learning." She smiled faintly. "I miss the libraries most of all." "I've got books," Yeager said, surprising her. "Not many, but good ones. My mother taught me to read by lamplight after the day's work was done." The conversation flowed easier after that, the storm forgotten as they discovered shared interests, a love of Dickens, opinions on the recent presidential election, memories of childhood adventures. Despite her grief and the impropriety of their situation, Zara found herself laughing at Yeager's dry wit and thoughtful observations. Hours passed, the storm finally abating as darkness fell. Yeager checked on the horses, then returned to find Zara yawning behind her hand. "You should take the cot," he said, gesturing to the narrow bed. "I'll be fine on the floor." "I couldn't put you out like that," she protested. "Please, Mrs. Richardson, I insist," Zara relented, too exhausted to argue further. She settled onto the thin mattress, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Good night, Mr. Hoffman, and thank you for everything." "Good night, Mrs. Richardson," he replied softly, spreading his coat on the floor nearby. In the darkness, Zara listened to his breathing, finding strange comfort in the presence of this man she'd known for less than a day. Grief still weighed heavily on her heart, but for the first time since receiving the telegram, she felt something else, a tiny spark of hope that perhaps her journey wasn't over after all. Morning came with brilliant sunshine and the songs of meadowlarks. Zara woke to find Yeager already outside, tending to the horses. Her dress was dry, if somewhat wrinkled, and she changed quickly before he returned. Their journey resumed with a new ease between them. The landscape seemed different in the wake of the storm, greener, more alive. Zara found herself noticing details she'd been too distraught to see the day before. The delicate purple of wildflowers, the graceful flight of hawks overhead, the way Yeager's hands held the reins with confident strength. As they crested a final hill, White Pine came into view, a bustling town nestled in a valley, with the telltale structures of mine operations visible on the surrounding slopes. "It's larger than I expected," Zara commented, anxiety creeping into her voice. What awaited her there? Thomas was gone, her future uncertain. "The silver strike brought folks running," Yeager explained. "Towns growing faster than services can keep up." He glanced at her. "Including the school." They rolled down the main street, drawing curious glances from townsfolk. Yeager guided the wagon to a modest 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Silver Dollar Hotel. "It's respectable," he assured her, helping her down. "The owner, Mrs. Caldwell, is a widow herself. She'll look after you while you—" He hesitated. "While you decide what comes next." Zara gripped his hand, suddenly reluctant to part from the one person who'd shown her kindness in this strange new place. "Will I see you again? I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised. "Need to deliver these supplies and see to my ranch, but I'll be back." True to his word, Yeager returned the following day and the day after that. He introduced her to the town's mayor, who was delighted to learn of her teaching experience, and to the minister, who offered condolences for her loss and assistance with whatever arrangements needed to be made for her late husband. A week passed, then two. Zara accepted the position at the school, moving from the hotel to a small room above the mercantile that came with the job. Thomas's body was recovered from the mine and laid to rest in the town cemetery. Zara stood dry-eyed at the simple service, mourning not just her husband but the dream that had brought them west, a dream that had always been more his than hers. Throughout it all, Yeager was a steady presence, never imposing, always respectful of her status as a recent widow but unfailingly reliable. He brought her books from his personal collection, helped her prepare the schoolhouse for the coming term, and occasionally appeared at her door with fresh eggs or vegetables from his garden. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Gossip was inevitable in a place like White Pine. But Mrs. Caldwell and the minister's wife defended Zara fiercely, and most agreed that Yeager Hoffman was not the sort of man to take advantage of a widow's vulnerable position. Summer faded into autumn, and the school term began. Zara found purpose in teaching the town's children, her natural talent for education earning her the respect of parents and the admiration of her pupils. The raw edges of her grief softened, though she continued to wear her black dresses out of respect for convention. It was on a crisp October afternoon, with the aspens blazing gold against the mountainsides, that Yeager appeared at the schoolhouse after the children had departed. He held his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mr. Hoffman," Zara greeted him with a warm smile. "This is a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Richardson," he began formally, then seemed to lose his nerve. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Zara, I was wondering if you might consider joining me for supper this Sunday at my ranch." His ears reddened. "Mrs. Caldwell would accompany you, of course, for propriety's sake." Zara felt color rise in her cheeks. "Yeager, are you courting me?" His eyes met hers directly. "If you'd allow it, yes, madam, I believe I am." "It's too soon," she said automatically, though her heart raced at his declaration. "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'll wait as long as necessary, but I wanted you to know my intentions." He took a step closer. "That day by the tracks, when I first saw you, I felt something I can't explain. Like I was meant to find you." Zara's breath caught. "I felt it too," she admitted softly. "But I was married and then I was grieving. And now," she looked at this man who had become so essential to her new life, his steady presence, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness. "Now I think I would very much like to have supper with you on Sunday." Yeager's smile lit his entire face. "I'll pick you and Mrs. Caldwell up at 4 o'clock. Sunday arrived with Zara in a flutter of anticipation. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wore a dress that wasn't black, a modest navy blue that Mrs. Caldwell assured her was entirely appropriate for a widow past the first stage of mourning. The ranch was everything Yeager had described and more. The main house was small but solidly built, with a wide porch and windows that caught the late afternoon light. A barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond them, rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," Zara said sincerely as he helped her down from the wagon. "It's home," he replied simply, "though it's been a bit lonely." Mrs. Caldwell, bless her, managed to make herself scarce throughout much of the evening, busying herself in the kitchen while Yeager showed Zara his property. They walked together through the garden where late vegetables still flourished, past the apple trees heavy with fruit, and up to a small rise that offered a view of the entire valley. "I come up here sometimes to think," Yeager said, standing close beside her, "to dream about the future." "And what do you see in that future?" Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "I see you if you'll have me. Not now, I respect that you need time, but someday." Zara looked up into his honest eyes, feeling a certainty she'd never known before. "I don't think I'll need as much time as propriety might demand," she admitted. Their first kiss was gentle and brief, but it sealed a promise between them as surely as any formal vow. Winter came early that year, blanketing White Pine in snow by mid-November. The school remained in session, with Yeager often appearing to escort Zara safely home through the drifts. Their courtship progressed with a decorum that satisfied even the town's strictest matrons, though the genuine affection between them was obvious to anyone who cared to look. Christmas Eve found them at the town's celebration in the newly built church. Candles glowed, children sang, and a sense of community warmed the space despite the howling blizzard outside. Yeager sat beside Zara, their shoulders touching, his presence as essential to her now as heir. When the service ended, he drew her aside in the church vestibule, away from curious eyes. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. Zara unwrapped it carefully to find a small leather-bound book of poetry Wordsworth, her favorite. "Oh, Yeager, it's perfect," she breathed, opening it to find an inscription on the flyleaf. "Read it," he urged softly. In his careful handwriting were the words, "To Zara, who has taught me that second chances are the Lord's greatest gift, will you make mine complete by becoming my wife?" Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place on a bright April morning the following spring, with wildflowers decorating the church and the entire town in attendance. Zara wore a dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, and Yeager cut a handsome figure in a new suit. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Zara told him as they danced at their wedding celebration. "Especially not when you found me crying by those tracks." "Best detour I ever made," he replied, holding her close. "Though I reckon it wasn't a detour at all, but the path I was always meant to take." They built their life together with purpose and joy, expanding the ranch, continuing Zara's teaching until their first child arrived, a daughter they named Hope. A son followed 2 years later, thriving in the clear mountain air and open spaces of their home. On their 5th anniversary, Yeager took Zara back to the spot where they'd first met. The railroad had expanded, with a proper station now standing where once there had been only a whistle stop, but the surrounding landscape remained largely unchanged. "I still remember exactly how you looked," he said, helping her down from their wagon. "So lost and alone. It broke my heart." Zara leaned against him, watching their children play nearby under the watchful eye of Mrs. Caldwell, who had accompanied them on this sentimental journey. "I was lost," she agreed, "until you found me." "No, love," he corrected gently, turning her to face him, "until we found each other." As the afternoon sun painted the prairie gold around them, Yeager lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their shared past, and the certainty of their future, together a future that had begun with a simple act of kindness, beside the tracks on a seemingly ordinary day that had changed everything. In the years that followed, as White Pine grew from a mining boomtown into a stable community, the story of how Yeager and Zara met became something of a local legend. Young couples would sometimes make the journey to the old whistle stop, now just a memory as progress marched on, hoping that some of the Hoffmans' good fortune might touch their own lives. And when their grandchildren asked for the story, as they invariably did on cold winter nights by the fire, Yeager and Zara would exchange a look of such profound understanding that words seemed almost unnecessary. But they would tell it anyway, this story of loss and finding, of grief transformed by love, of a widow crying beside the tracks and the cowboy who stopped his wagon and changed both their lives forever.